Segment 27A, Introduction. This highly exciting lecture traces the development of American foreign policy, with a little domestic policy thrown in, from the beginning of World War I to the end of World War II. Although victory in World War I promised a safer world for all involved, the reality was rather different. The dawn of World War II found the U.S. still reeling from the Great Depression and none too eager for foreign entanglements, especially foreign entanglements involving Germany or Japan. In segment 27B, Safe for Democracy, we take up World War I, the conflict which, according to Woodrow Wilson, would make the world safe for democracy. The United States had done its best to stay out of the war, but German aggression ultimately forced the United States in. The Americans played a key role in the Allied victory, and they hoped to bring along a moderate peace along the line of Wilson's 14 points. Yet the Allies and the American Congress alike rejected Wilson's 14 points initiative, with disastrous results. Because of the harsh 1919 Treaty of Versailles, Germany was punished too heavily, and Japan was left effectively out in the cold. Soviet Russia was ignored. All of this would cause later consequences. Although Wilson's dreams were occasionally vague, and his thinking sometimes verged upon racism, he was the first great world statesman the United States produced. In segment 27C, Isolationism and Depression, the United States emerges from World War I with a set of worries all its own. The biggest worry provoked by the Bolshevik Revolution was that America might experience something similar. A string of strikes, demonstrations, and terrorist attacks heightened the fear and led to a recurrence of isolationism. When America finally returned to something approaching an even keel, the Great Depression changed every American's life for the worse. Understandably, the early and middle 1930s saw Americans become even more fixated on domestic issues. Unfortunately, Germany and Japan had started building empires by this time. While France and Britain waffled, and the Soviets decided who they were going to side with, America slept. Fortunately, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt remained awake. In segment 27D, America in World War II, America is dragged into the Second World War by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Unlike in the First World War, Americans were solidly behind the war against the Axis. Even Japanese Americans who had been shamefully and unfairly interned in camps were solidly behind the war and volunteered to fight. While the Soviet Union, as mentioned earlier, did the lion's share of the fighting and suffering in what they called the Great Patriotic War, the U.S. fought and won the Pacific War almost single-handedly, while making major contributions to the Second Front in Europe. The war ended with President Harry S. Truman's controversial decision to drop atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities, and with the resolve never to experience such a terrible war again. So far, so good. And oh yes, as a result of the war, the United States ended up as one of the world's 2 great superpowers. Segment 27B, Safe for Democracy. When World War I erupted in 1914, most Americans hoped we would stay out completely. American sympathies were clearly with the Allied states, Britain, France, and Russia. But isolationism made sense at this point. Europe was far away, and the U.S. Army was extremely small. Indeed, Woodrow Wilson won re-election in 1916, claiming he had kept America out of war. However, in 1917, Germany's declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare forced America into the war. German U-boats would now sink any ship suspected of bringing cargo to England or France anytime, anywhere. Also, a German diplomat was caught red-handed begging Mexico to join a war against the U.S. On April 6, 1917, President Wilson persuaded Congress to declare war. Even so, the vote was not unanimous, nor was public opinion completely behind the war. As the raw American troops, doughboys they were called, arrived in France, the other Allies wanted to use them to patch up their shattered units. The U.S. commander, General Pershing, insisted that the American troops would fight with other American troops, and that was it, or not at all. The million American troops who fought in Europe did not exactly win the First World War. More accurately, they tipped the balance in a blood-soaked 3-year slugfest. And as the balance tipped, Woodrow Wilson started revealing his plan to make the world safe for democracy. The 14 points. Democracy was not, however, totally safe back on the home front. Americans of German descent were harassed. German language and culture became objects of hatred. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage, and Spitz dogs became known as Eskimo Terriers. On another level, the Wilson administration lashed out against dissenters, both directly and through right-wing front organizations. In 1918, the Sedition Act was passed by Congress and signed by Wilson, making it illegal to use disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government, U.S. flag, or U.S. armed forces. Many patriotic Americans whose only crime was disagreement with Woodrow's policies found themselves imprisoned or even deported. One sublime irony is that while Woodrow Wilson's America deported people to Soviet Union for communist sympathies, Vladimir Lenin's Russia was deporting people westward for Western sympathies. To President Wilson, a democratic world had no place for empires. On January 8, 1918, he delivered his famous 14-point speech to a joint session of Congress. Prompted at least somewhat by Lenin's no peace, no war doctrine, Wilson supported moderate treatment for the Central Powers if and when they surrendered. His 14th point called for the creation of an international organization devoted to maintaining world peace, the future League of Nations. There is some evidence that the hope of a moderate peace brought the Central Powers to the negotiation table sooner rather than later. When the armistice finally came on November 11, 1918, it was just taken for granted the 14 points would be the basis of a peace treaty. Yet when the treaty negotiations began in Versailles, France, it turned out Britain and France wanted to punish Germany after all. The consequences of this Versailles Treaty would be dire indeed. Since the U.S. Senate balked at signing this clearly punitive treaty, the U.S. instead signed separate treaties with Germany and Germany's allies. The Senate also refused to enter the newly created League of Nations on Wilson's terms. Wilson rejected the Senate's compromise proposal, blocking America's entry into the League of Nations for good. Deprived of American contributions, the League was doomed to fail. The First World War did not make the whole world safe for democracy. Some former subject nations did indeed get independence. Plucky Poland, my homeland, last seen being partitioned by Russia, Germany, and Austria during the 18th century, was reassembled as a buffer state separating Germany from the Soviet Union. But national self-determination was not automatically granted to everyone. Nations of the non-white European colonies were notably out of luck. While Wilson was at Versailles for the treaty negotiations, a young Vietnamese named Nguyen Ai Quoc wrote to request a meeting with him. Nguyen wanted a chance to persuade Wilson that French Indochina deserved independence under the framework of the 14 powers just as much as Poland and Belgium did, for example. The meeting never took place. Nguyen Ai Quoc eventually rose to power in the Vietnamese Communist Party under the name Ho Chi Minh. Despite Wilson's calls for more reasonable peace terms, the Versailles Treaty's severe economic punishment upon Germany led directly to the rise of Hitler's Third Reich and thus to World War II in Europe. The Versailles Treaty also completely ignored the overpopulated Japan's need for land and raw materials. This oversight assisted the rise of Japanese imperialism and led to World War II in the Pacific. We've seen that Wilson's grand designs ultimately failed, but he was on the right track toward world peace. Even if Wilson's vision didn't extend to non-Caucasian peoples like the Vietnamese, it was remarkable anyway. It was an honorable attempt. It showed not just the American people's political and military maturity, but it showed American intellectual maturity. The best hope for peace after the First World War had come from a nation not a century and a half old. Segment 27C, Isolationism and Depression. While the First World War was supposedly making the world safe for democracy, the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 raised fears of a revolution in the United States. Although the American Communist Party did not yet exist, labor management strife was nothing new. The more radical labor groups, like their Russian counterparts, played on these fears with terrorist tactics. On April 28, 1919, a bomb mailed to the mayor of Seattle was successfully defused. On June 2nd, a bomb partially destroyed the home of the U.S. Attorney General. On June 3rd, another bomb exploded near the house of a New York City judge. On September 16, 1920, a huge bomb exploded in front of the J.P. Morgan Company's Wall Street office, killing 38 people and injuring 300 others. These terrorist attacks were also accompanied by a wave of violent strikes and demonstrations. Because the labor movement in particular represented many immigrants, immigrants and union members in general tended to be lumped in with the handful of genuine terrorists. As in the days of the Know-Nothings, quote-unquote native white Americans agitated against the foreigners, supposedly flooding in and destroying American culture. At least the Germans got a little break once World War I was over. In 1929, the United States' gravy days came to an end. In hindsight, warning signs had appeared well before the stock market crash of Thursday, October 24th, 1929. But for Americans of the time, Black Thursday marked the official beginning of the Great Depression. Unlike the American Civil War, which took its toll mostly on the military, their families, and those poor souls who had the war fought in their backyard, the Great Depression deeply affected every American in one way or another. The United States' woes either triggered or echoed, depending on how one looks at it, a worldwide economic deflation and a great hike in unemployment. In Germany, already battered by the Treaty of Versailles, economic disaster made Hitler's demented drivel sound appealing. America's survival of the Great Depression is a tribute to the inspired leadership of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But it is much more a tribute to the American people's native resilience and hard work. America's isolationist streak, already well established in the run-up to the First World War, reemerged with a vengeance through the early 1930s. Fix America first, and forget about the rest of the world, and avoid those foreign entanglements. America then placed foreign policy on the back burner, along with military spending, which was a mistake. Pulling America out of the Great Depression was important. It was job one, but it was no excuse for America to stick its head in the sand over what was going on in Europe. By 1936, the losers of Versailles, Japan and Germany, were bidding for empire. Japan had conquered Manchuria. Germany had reconquered the Rhineland. Together with Italy, which had managed to conquer Ethiopia, they created the Anti-Comintern Pact. The Axis, as Germany, Japan, and Italy was also called, was anti-communist mainly at name. What they really wanted was world domination. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 became a proxy war between the Axis and the Soviet Union. In 1938, Hitler pushed the envelope by annexing Austria along with pieces of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France continued trying to buy time. The USSR agonized over whether to side with the Axis or with the West. Meanwhile, the United States maintained strict neutrality. The U.S. refused to trade with countries at war and would not let American ships carry military goods. As during World War I, Americans naturally sympathized with the British and French. But this time around, they were fixated on avoiding another European entanglement. Finally, the fall of France in summer 1940 made President Roosevelt commit to the Allied side, regardless of public opinion. Re-elected to a third term that November, Roosevelt prepared the United States for eventual war against the Axis. Slowly, Congress came around to Roosevelt's views and voted for a peacetime draft and massive rearmament programs. The Lend-Lease program of 1941 let Roosevelt send military goods to any nation, at first Great Britain, later the Soviet Union and China, deemed vital to the defense of the United States. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Britain and France gained an ally but little more. In August 1941, Roosevelt agreed to the Atlantic Charter with Prime Minister Churchill of Great Britain. They affirmed joint war goals, even though the U.S. had not yet entered a war. America was now neutral only in name. Not all Americans were thrilled with Roosevelt's foreign policy. The America First movement was founded in 1940 on the principle that America must stay out of international wars. America First's membership was very diverse, including, among others, the old socialist Norman Thomas and the future Republican President Gerald R. Ford. America First was also supported by hardcore isolationists and other tinfoil hat types, including the lucky Charles A. Lindbergh. But after the Japanese sneak attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Americans of all beliefs united to defend their beloved nation. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war against the U.S. in support of their Japanese ally. Roosevelt's underhand machinations began to look a lot better. Segment 27D, America in World War II. The Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor shocked Americans out of their isolationism. The U.S. quickly joined the British-Soviet alliance against the Empire of Japan, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany, better known as the Axis. Unlike the hysteria during World War I, the U.S. domestic scene in World War II was relatively peaceful. Even the America First movement died out. German and Italian aliens were rounded up and interned, but Americans of German and Italian descent were not persecuted in any other way. Sadly, this was not true for Japanese American citizens, many of whom were interned by the U.S. government. Though these Japanese Americans were not held in labor camps, they were inflicted with forced isolation and substandard living conditions. They had every right to be outraged at this form of ethnic cleansing. Yet many Japanese Americans fought voluntarily and bravely on the European front. On a more positive note, American involvement in World War II greatly helped pull our nation out of the Great Depression, both economically and emotionally. The Japanese quickly captured Britain's far eastern territories, leaving the U.S. to fight the Pacific War almost all alone. The Soviets and Japanese also left each other alone until the USSR jumped into the war on Japan in summer 1945. The nationalist Chinese had a large, well-equipped army, but Chiang Kai-shek was more interested in using it to fight communists than he was in using it to fight Japan. The Pacific War was a secondary priority anyway. The fall of France left mainland Europe totally in Axis hands. British and later American troops fought the Germans and Italians in North Africa, but the Soviets bore the brunt of the German war effort. Italy was invaded in 1943, but this was not the big second front the Soviets so desperately needed. Finally, the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, forced Germany to fight a two-front war. Even with the long-awaited major second front, it took 4 years to defeat Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire. Though the Soviet Union suffered far more casualties than its allies, America's commitment to the war was also crucial to Allied victory. U.S. aid was also important. The Soviets produced their own weaponry for the most part, but Lend-Lease provided the Soviets with desperately needed raw materials and consumer goods, enabling Soviet facilities to concentrate solely on military production. The USSR undoubtedly suffered the most during the Second World War, to a level Americans can't really understand. That said, America has nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be proud of. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not live to see the end of the war. He died of a stroke on April 12, 1945, succeeded by his Vice President Harry S. Truman of Missouri. Roosevelt's wartime policies remained in effect, and one of these was to get the Soviets to help fight the Pacific War. Given the Japanese fanatical military spirit, defeating Japan might take years of bloody fighting and millions of lives. Logically, Soviet help would bring the Pacific War to a much quicker end than the U.S. could accomplish all by itself. The Soviets did jump eagerly into the Pacific War after Germany surrendered in May 1945, but they wouldn't stay engaged for long. He had been kept in the dark as vice president, but when Truman learned that atomic bombs were ready to be used on Japan, he decided to go ahead and use them. On August 6, 1945, the first American atomic bomb effectively destroyed Hiroshima, Japan. A second atomic bomb dropped on August 9th leveled Nagasaki. The Japanese surrendered on September 2nd. One can argue that Truman's decision to drop atomic bombs unleashed the specter of nuclear war. But it cannot be denied that thousands and thousands and possibly millions of lives were saved in the long run, Allied lives and Japanese lives alike. And so far, thank God, the first atomic bombs used on humans have also been the last. The Japanese formally surrendered on September 2nd. Efforts to maintain the peace for good were already underway. On October 24th, 1945, the United Nations, or UN, was established, a world body meant to succeed where the League of Nations had failed in preventing future world wars. On December 4th, 1945, by a vote of 65-7, the Senate approved American participation in the United Nations. All of the world's nations were invited to join the organization, but major control belonged to the UN's Security Council. Smaller nations served 2-year terms on the Security Council, with the 5 permanent members being the United States, Great Britain, France, Nationalist China, and the USSR. Each of these 5 permanent members could veto any United Nations actions. This became complicated when the Red Chinese took over from the Nationalists. Even then, the Nationalist Chinese had a veto where the Red Chinese did not. The UN marked a turn away from America's traditional isolationism. Although the United States and the Soviet Union would soon part, go their own way at the head of their respective political blocs, the UN was a stabilizing force during the impending Cold War. Willingly or not, the United States had become one of the world's 2 superpowers. How were we going to handle that? Eep! Segment 27E, Conclusions. 1. An American Paradox. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was a study in contradictions. Virginian-born, he became president of Princeton University in 1902 and governor of New Jersey in 1910. Although passionately committed to the cause of democracy in the abstract, he was also a white supremacist who believed openly in the inferiority of blacks and immigrants. As president, he lashed out hard at anyone who dared disagree with him, individuals, organizations, or even Congress. Yet Wilson's vision for ending the war and creating lasting world peace through the 14 points rightly earned him the 1919 Nobel Peace Prize. The world, I think it's safe to say, will never attain Wilson's ideal, a network of democratic nation-states united in peace through an international organization of nations. It's frankly kind of hard to see Wilson himself comfortable in that sort of setting. But his ideas were a big step in the right direction. 2. Count us out. America has always possessed an isolationist streak. George Washington himself didn't always follow his advice about avoiding foreign entanglements. Once the War of 1812 ended the prospect of foreign invasions, Americans quit caring about having a strong military. Inventions such as the steamship effectively shrank the world, drawing us closer to Europe through technological means. Yet Americans kept wanting to stay the hell out. The America First movement of 1940 was a great example. The membership included both radical right-wingers and radical left-wingers, and it started with the presumption that President Roosevelt was either exaggerating when he spoke about the Axis menace, or he was downright lying. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor proved Roosevelt was right. It's also interesting to note that when the next looming menace, the Soviet Union, appeared after the Second World War, there was no talk of isolation anymore. 3. The cutting edge. World War I brought the submarine, the warplane, the tank, and chemical warfare. Although the submarine, warplane, and tank would undergo further development and be used in World War II as they are today, at least the world was spoiled future chemical wars. Of course, World War II also brought the atomic bomb, which fortunately we have not used again to this day. But still, the nastiest, most chilling aspect of World War II was the simple, brutish cruelty demonstrated by the combatants. The Germans actively practiced genocide against Jews, Poles, and other conquered nationalities. The Soviets practiced ethnic cleansing upon their own people, such as the Chechens. The United States sent Japanese American citizens to internment camps. The Germans, Japanese, and Soviets all worked prisoners of war to death. Frighteningly, I believe it will always be not so much the technology that kills, but the good old-fashioned human evil operating the technology. 4. The greatest generation. My parents were kids during the Great Depression and the Second World War. Maybe your parents belong to this generation too. More likely, it's your grandparents. Regardless, Americans born in the years between the two world wars have lived through more history than any other American generation. It's easy for those of us born after the Second World War to see that the Depression wouldn't last, or that the Allies would win World War II. But back in the day, there was no guarantee that America wouldn't go broke. There was no guarantee that the Axis wouldn't win. This generation faced poverty and rationing and the loss of loved ones, but they got back and came out on top. If you haven't had the chance to talk with one of these senior citizens about what life was like during the Great Depression and the Second World War, please do yourself a favor and hurry up. This opportunity will not be around forever.